Fun.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, the Caribbean Solidarity Network, and our conversation on Cuba, COVID-19, and the Caribbean, Internationalism and Anti-Capitalism. I'm Grace, and the other host tonight is Runako, who will be introducing our speaker and the topic. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that if you're participating from somewhere in the Americas tonight, we're all on stolen land. And if you've attended other events in Toronto, you're likely very familiar with the names of the Indigenous and the First Nations listed in land acknowledgements, the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. You will have heard that this territory is covered by the dish with one spoon, wampum belt covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwe and allied nations. But these acknowledgements, as we know, speak of the past, and they speak of the past as if it were settled, as if the present is not replete with violence and erasure, and as if the future were not in jeopardy because of our collective inability to face our histories. So as we acknowledge the Indigenous and the First Nations of this land that we're gathered on, as we recognize that this land has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years, we at the Caribbean Solidarity Network would also like to take this moment to ask, what are we doing to build Indigenous futures? This is significant for us as Caribbean people and people in solidarity with the Caribbean. Firstly, as people who have been displaced from their homelands due to histories of enslavement, indentureship, colonialism, there is a connected and complicated relationship of dispossession and displacement through colonial structures and imperialist ideologies. After all, in many places in the Americas, stolen lands have also needed stolen bodies for labor, and the theft and genocidal violence goes hand in hand. And second, we're also asking what our responsibilities are to Indigenous peoples here and anywhere we are in the Americas. Our futures are all connected. So what are we doing to repair and build futures together? These are questions that we don't have answers for, but as an organization, as communities, we want to put in the work in the context of solidarity to get there. And with that, I'll hand it over to Runako.
Thank you, Grace. So again, my name is Runako. I'll be hosting this event. As you know, we are talking about internationalism and anti-capitalism as it relates to Cuba, COVID-19, and the Caribbean. We are pleased to be joined today. Well, I suppose even before I introduce the speaker, just to let you know what our intention is tonight. So we wanted to have a discussion today because as the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded, we saw the United States turn inward and begin to unravel, denying healthcare to millions of its own citizens, while blocking shipments of respirators to Barbados, the Bahamas, and Cayman Islands, and deporting COVID-19 positive patients back to Haiti and Jamaica. In contrast, Cuba reached out not just to the Caribbean, where they sent over 500 medical professionals to all corners of the region, but also to the world. Leading by example, Cuba demonstrated another way forward, showing that the way to combat COVID-19 was through the extension of compassion, science, and solidarity, with great success. Today, we are grateful for our guest, Mr. Isaac Saney of the Canadian Network on Cuba. Dr. Saney is Professor of History at Dalhousie University and the author of Cuba, A Revolution in Motion. We will discuss the vital role that Cuban medical brigades have played across the Caribbean, the lessons learned from Cuba's internationalism, and the struggle to invent and distribute a true people's vaccine against COVID-19. Mr. Saney, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine. It's a pleasure to be on the webinar organized here by the Caribbean Solidarity Network. I support the work that you're doing, and I look forward to a rich and informative discussion and exchange of ideas.
As do I. So just to start off, could you share a bit about what Cuba has done in response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay. I think Cuba's position in terms of fighting the COVID-19 pandemic has been unprecedented in terms of what we've seen unfold in the world. At the present that I'm speaking, at the time of writing, there's over 4,000 Cuban medical personnel, doctors and other healthcare professionals who are serving in at least 39 countries. And every day it changes. The Cubans were on the ground in Italy when Italy was the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis, right? But Cuba has medical brigades serving throughout the Caribbean. In fact, I was talking to a very good friend of mine, Dr. Fuwa Cooper, who is a celebrated historian of Jamaican origin in Canada, who's done a tremendous amount of work on Canadian history and Caribbean history. And I was talking to her in Barbados, and she went to get a test for COVID, and there were Cuban doctors there in Barbados, right? So the Cubans are not only providing the kind of assistance for COVID in terms of basically deciding to share what they have with the rest of the world, but also they're bringing a level of expertise. And of course, it's important to bear in mind, this is not unique in the history of the Cuban Revolution. Cuba's medical internationalism stretches back to 1960 when they sent a medical brigade to Chile in the wake of the earthquake in Chile. We also remember when the Ebola epidemic was raging through West Africa, right? And the United States sent soldiers. Cuba said, and they said it during Security Council, that humanity owes a debt to Africa. And they played a central role in combating the Ebola epidemic. And so, and these internationalist missions, at the heart of them have been the Henry Reeve International Brigade that has been nominated now numerous times from very significant personalities for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. So from the very beginning that the pandemic erupted, Cuba was willing to assist. And they're not only sending their doctors of this expertise, there is also the various pharmaceutical interventions that they've created. So for example, they have interferon, alpha 2B interferon recombinant that has been very significant in treating COVID-19. In fact, it stops the transmission very significantly between patients and healthcare worker. Not one single Cuban doctor has died on the island or on any of the internationalist missions because of contracting COVID-19. And it's because of these different treatments they have and so on. And they've made those available to the world. And right now, and the point you were making, as soon as the pandemic hit, the United States adopted a me first policy, right? Okay, and of course, in the United States, what me first means, it doesn't mean African Americans, it doesn't mean Hispanics, it doesn't mean the poor and powerless, it doesn't mean indigenous people. Obviously we have to understand that it means the rich and powerful will be the ones, right, who can insulate themselves from pandemics. But they began denying, as you said, respirators and other equipment going to other islands. And what's important here is that under the Trump regime, they instituted over 240 different vindictive economic sanctions against Cuba. Never has US economic sanctions been more viciously, more cruelly, and zealously prosecuted than under the Trump regime. And they denied Cuba access to all sorts of things, from masks to testing to things that we consider to be essential to fight COVID-19. Yet, despite Cuba's shortages, they were determined to share what they have, the expertise and the resources with the rest of the world. So there's these doctors who are serving all over. And of course, the big news is that Cuba is now going to produce, they have 4 vaccines in trial. And one of them, Soberano Uno, is ready for production. And they're going to produce 100 million doses of that vaccine. The entire Cuban population will be vaccinated by the end of 2021, but they're going to make those other 100 million vaccine doses available, I'm sure, to the rest of the Caribbean, Latin America, and the global South. So as you pointed out in your introduction, the Cubans themselves represent an alternative model of international relations, a model of human solidarity, a model of social love, right? It may sound cheesy and corny in some people's ears, but what Cuba has done since the triumph of the revolution by aiding countries in need when they've suffered from earthquakes and epidemics, to their selfless aid to the African anti-colonial national liberation struggles, particularly the struggle against the racist apartheid state of South Africa at the time, has set a model that we can have relations in the world, not based on wealth, not based on plunder, not based on selfishness, not based on egoism, but an attempt to truly build relations of human solidarity between human beings. And it's truly amazing to watch what Cuba has done with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know I'm going on at length here, but I'm also apart from being a Cuba, so-called Cuba specialist and a historian, I'm also, as you pointed out, one of the co-chairs and a national spokesperson for the Canadian Network on Cuba. And we have been part of launching with the national network on Cuba in the United States, a Saving Lives campaign, right? Where we are calling for the Canadian and the United States government, as they face, especially in the US, as they face this this disaster that's really manufactured politically by the ruling elites. Their criminal indifference to the lives of African Americans, their criminal indifference to the lives of essential workers, their criminal indifference to the lives of indigenous peoples. And we see what's happening in Manitoba in Canada. We have said that the Cubans offer the opportunity to provide significant assistance, right, to fighting those pandemics. And so we've launched a Saving Lives campaign, calling for medical cooperation and collaboration with Cuba, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing perhaps about allowing Cuban pharmaceuticals that have been so successful in combating, at least ameliorating and mitigating the COVID-19 infection itself, up to allowing Cuban medical brigades to come. And in Canada, there was a request from a First Nations community in Manitoba that was turned down by the Canadian government. And so, this represents the fact that Cuba represents a reservoir. As they say, most countries share the many among the few. Cuba is a country that attempts to share the few among the many, right? A poor country facing an unceasing economic war from the United States, a criminal assault from the most powerful country the world has ever known. And yet, despite this, they are willing to share what little they have in fighting these horrible epidemics.
Thank you for that. I guess I want to swing back a little bit to this point about Cuba trying to assist others during the course of the pandemic, which we know has been going on for nearly a full year now in terms of its impacts outside of China, where it's said to have originated. Are you aware of any direct examples of countries that, well, because you spoke about the Canadian government not allowing Cuba to provide assistance to an indigenous community in that province, but are you aware of countries that have allowed for Cuban doctors to come in, just either inside, within the Caribbean or outside the Caribbean? Are you aware of anything like that happening? Or specific examples, I should say?
Yeah, well, like Cuban doctors in Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, St. Lucia, right? I mean, for example, in St. Lucia, there's 133 Cuban medical collaborators, if we may say so, right? In St. Vincent, Barbados, Dominica, Haiti, Jamaica. I have a very good friend who I went to school with from Dominica, right? And, he's been treated by Cuban doctors, right? In Haiti. And of course, Cuba has a long relationship with Haiti. And I want to sort of spend some time on Haiti because when the earthquake hit Haiti in 2010, right? Cuban doctors were not only the first people that they were already on the ground in Haiti. And Cuba feels a particular historical kinship with Haiti. Just as when Haiti had the revolution in 1791 and the risen Africans led the only first successful slavery revolt in history, and basically established a republic that I would argue expanded the envelope of freedom far beyond what the French Revolution and the so-called American Revolution have been lauded for. The Haitian Revolution, as you know, faced an isolationist war. I mean, what they call a cordon sanitaire, to isolate them economically and diplomatically. And the Cubans feel that, in a sense, what happened to the Cuban Revolution when they triumphed mirrors what happened to Haiti. And in fact, Cuba owes a debt to Haiti because Haiti, in a sense, was a trailblazer for the struggle to achieve independence and self-determination. So there are Cuban doctors in Haiti. There are Cuban doctors, 138 at last count in Jamaica. In Belize, there are 58 Cuban doctors, and there are Cuban doctors in Suriname. There are doctors in Mexico. The Mexican president just thanked the Cuban doctors for the critical role they played in fighting COVID in Mexico. In Honduras, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela. I mean, Cuba obviously has a long relationship with Venezuela. And Venezuela also on its own has done very well despite the sanctions by the United States and the attempt to intervene politically in in Venezuela. The Venezuelans have handled the COVID extremely well. There are Cuban doctors in Togo and Angola. And of course, Cuba has a long relationship with Angola, particularly because of Cuba's critical role in the anti-colonial national liberation struggles in Southern Africa. There were doctors in Italy, for example, at the height of the pandemic. Cuban doctors were serving in the Lombard region, where it was the worst. And in fact, where Cuban doctors served, the COVID number of deaths went down very significantly, and so forth. And the Cuban doctors in Qatar. And I'm sure there are more doctors, more requests coming in. People are, bringing in them all the time because they recognize that Cuba is making a significant contribution, right? I mean, I mentioned Angola. There's 219 Cuban health collaborators in Angola, right? And and even there are doctors in Cape Verde. I haven't mentioned Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Okay, there are doctors there as well. And so Cuba basically has, in a sense, right, made an offer to the entire world. They have limited resources, but there's no country that requests Cuban assistance that doesn't receive this Cuban assistance, right? What happens with we talk about the case in Canada, and in fact, there's an explosion in both the Navajo Nation in the United States and the Manitoba First Nations, that community has responded. There's an explosion of COVID in it. And of course, in Canada, the request has to come from the federal government. And we know that Christian Freeland, who was then foreign minister, okay, and is now deputy prime minister in Canada, she was very active in trying not only to undermine Venezuela, but also she has a long history of opposing, shall we say, social projects, historical projects of what the Cubans have embarked on. So there's no country that has asked and been refused Cuba's assistance.
Wow, I mean, that's really incredible, especially considering that Cuba has a population of 10, 11 million. So it's not a large country, and just to be able to provide that sort of assistance to much larger nations like Canada and like just regions in as far away as the continent of Africa is amazing. Yeah. I appreciate that you providing that information for us.
Yeah. And an important point is that Cuba has 3 times the doctors per capita that Canada has. Okay, so for example, in my province and in many provinces in Canada, there are many people who don't have access to a family doctor. Okay, and so in Cuba, when you go to Cuba, what do you mean you don't have access to a family doctor? They have what they call is the family doctor sort of a model, right? Where that doctor knows everybody in this community and visits them, right? And so healthcare in Cuba is a universal right. Okay, it's not something determined by your pocketbook. It's not something determined by your power and influence. It's your right as a human being. Yes, Cuba has medical shortages, right? And in fact, one of the things that the Canadian Network in Cuba just launched, we just launched a campaign to raise funds to buy medical supplies for Cuba. The Cubans have given us a list, right? Because they face a significant economic blockade from the United States, right? Attempting to asphyxiate it. Even at this time, while you would say that, the Cuban foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, said, listen, the COVID virus does not know borders, right? This is a time for us to join together internationally, regardless of politics, to unite in fighting this threat that's facing all of us, right? Let's unite in this. And even with the COVID pandemic, the United States under Trump tightened this. We hope perhaps Biden will return to the Obama policy, which adopted a different way of trying to, shall we say, undermine the Cuban Revolution, but said, listen, let's try a less aggressive method, right? Okay, so it was for the Cubans a welcome relief. But under Trump, they tightened it. And even as the pandemic raged in the United States, over 420,000 people are dead, right? 4,000 people were dying a day, right? In LA, I understand, LA County, 1 in 8 people is infected with the COVID virus, right? Okay, and we know the figures are probably high, the official figures, because the Trump regime, had basically handcuffed the CDC, which was collecting all the figures, right? So it's become a pandemic that's raging and it's affecting, those who have the least power in the society, least political influence, and essential workers. Now, like for example, on the front lines, it tends to be Black and Hispanic workers, right, who are on the front lines. And you have a choice. Do I not go to work, okay, and therefore can't pay my rent? get evicted, can't feed my children, or do I have to go? I mean, that's the calculus of capitalism, right? In Cuba, because we've spoken about Cuba's internationalist mission, inside Cuba themselves, they're dealing with COVID. I mean, they had there's been a spike in cases, right? But they're making sure everybody is provided with medication. Everybody will receive a vaccine, right? Okay. And in fact, what happens is Cuba developed some homeopathy, immunity boosters, right? Okay, for the population. And the family doctor went from house to house, making sure everybody received those sort of homeopathy medicines and so forth. So it represents a very different model than the dog-eat-dog model, right? That we see unfolding in the United States. It's truly frightening. I talk to friends in the United States, and they're just terrified, right? And I talk to friends who have either had COVID who have lost loved ones, right? And it's just, they're left to fend for themselves, while Cuba offers a different model. But within the island, we're dealing with all the difficulties, challenges it's facing economically, and outside of the island as well, with its internationalism.
Yeah, and again, it just also illustrates, I mean, you've been making that comparison to the United States, which is the richest country in the world, probably in the history of the world. And yet it can't provide anything to support or to provide care for its citizens who are suffering during this pandemic at an alarming rate. I believe the last figure is that 500,000 Americans will have died before the end of February.
Yeah,
which is startling when you think about it.
Yeah.
Just shifting gears a little bit, my co-host Grace has a question to ask you as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Saney. And just to add to the last point that both of you made, it's obviously not just the United States. I mean, here in Ontario, the government, there was a report that came out at the end of December that showed that the provincial government is sitting on billions of dollars of allocated funds that they're not releasing. So, here it's the same thing. They're deliberately sitting on funds, and they're saying that this is, they're calling it an emergency, but they're also saying it's not an emergency enough, right, to release these funds. So Cuba.
And before you answer the question, sort of segue on that. I mean, we have this COVID pandemic raging in the United States, right? And in Canada, okay, sir. And we have this huge military budget that passed with bipartisan support. So that's clearly, a demonstration of where the ruling circles have their priorities. And Canada is actually going to be investing more in the military as well. And so it demonstrates, when we talk about, the COVID pandemic has really revealed, right, the fact that we need different economic and social and political arrangements that serve the people, right? And not these arrangements with not only disempower, but basically almost act as ways by which we get exterminated.
Exactly. So I was wondering if you could actually talk about how Cuba has navigated the embargoes. And so it's a two-part question. So how has Cuba navigated the embargoes, and also the significant amount of, and the barrage of negative propaganda, especially in terms of their healthcare system and the talk of shortages, or talk that their own people aren't being taken care of? If you was wondering if you can, thank you.
Well, I'd say the first thing that Cuba has done to deal with the economic blockade has been their own social solidarity, right? To be able to use the limited resources that they have for the benefit of the people. One of the things about Cuba is, like, it sort of belies the image that we have that people from the so-called third world, the global south, and particularly from the Caribbean, we can't be organized, right? Cuba, is very organized in dealing with the things. So first and foremost is prioritizing the fact that the wealth in society has to be utilized and deployed for the benefit of the peoples. Cuba just recently announced its latest budget at the National Assembly, and it's basically it's the largest allocation ever for social security programs and for health before. So they're putting the resources in. That being said, how they deal with the blockade is one, trying to build solidarity against it. So they have groups such as the Caribbean Solidarity Network, the Canadian Network on Cuba, and other groups who carry on education that the blockade is a fundamental violation of international law and rights of the Cuban people, and to build that kind of public consciousness as well, right, in opposition to it. But where they have tremendous success as well is diplomatically. As many of your listeners must know, that since 1992, almost every year, except for last year, because of COVID, the vote has been moved to May 21st of this year. The international community has overwhelmingly condemned the US economic measures against Cuba. So Cuba tries to overcome the embargo by building relations with other countries. They had a very good relationship with Venezuela. Economic difficulties have happened. They have a good economic relations with China. They have relations with Europe and so forth. But because of the economic blockade, it makes cost for Cuba that much more expensive. So for example, ships that enter, shall we say, that travel to Cuba to deliver goods, then have to reckon that they might not be allowed into the United States. So therefore, Cuba has to pay them extra to compensate for that, right? As we all know, the United States, even though its relative economic power is declining vis-a-vis the rise of China and so on, right? It is still the dominant economic power in the world. And the US dollar is what we call the international reserve currency. I know 70% of all international transactions, maybe more, take place in the US dollar in hard currency. Cuba has just gone through, some people may know, a monetary unification, right? But even before that, the Cuban currency, has no real value on the world stage. Almost all countries from the global south buy in US dollars or some other currency, right? Cuba is prohibited by US law in holding bank accounts in US dollars, right? So UBS, which was a Swiss bank, was fined a few years ago $100 billion for allowing Cuba to hold that. So Cuba finds various ways to get around the blockade, right? Okay, so the cases, for example, this is a case from years ago where like there was a particular pediatric cancer, right? Okay, and that's very rare, and some kids were suffering from it. And the medicine cost something like $30,000 a box, right? And because of the US economic sanctions, Cuba couldn't get that box. They couldn't buy it from them, right? They found roundabout ways through third parties to buy that medicine at higher prices so they could treat whichever children were suffering from it. So how they deal with the economic blockade quite often, and it's been extremely stringent under the 4 years of the Trump regime, over 200 different measures. There was a lessening up, at least of certain measures through presidential orders issued by Barack Obama when he was president. So that lessened it to a certain extent. But what's happened is Trump tightened it even further, right? And so what they've had to do is it's created shortages on the island, okay? So one of the things that's contributed to a spike in COVID cases in Cuba are two things. One, Cuban Americans who were traveling to visit their family. Some of them, it seems a lot of them actually hadn't followed the kind of protocols and actually had brought COVID onto the island. And the other thing is because of the shortages caused by the blockade, right? Because the US is the largest market. If Cuba is not allowed access to certain markets, if Cuba doesn't have the funds to buy, if pressure is put on other countries not to trade with Cuba, it creates shortages on the island. And so people are queuing in long lines. And if you queue in long lines, even if you're wearing masks, it increases the possibilities of contracting or infecting or spreading COVID-19 and so forth. So what they're doing now is a major efficiency campaign to use the limited resources they have in the best and most effective ways they can, right? And there's they're involved in that. And hopefully the unification occurrence will bring in more efficiencies and so forth, right? Also, what they're attempting to do is very gradually and very controlled open up tourism, right? So when tourists come in, they have to quarantine, mandatorily quarantine, they get tested for COVID, and they're also given a nasal form of interferon, which is a mist. Interferon is a drug that's naturally produced by the human beings. It boosts the immune system. Cuba has been producing since the 1980s alpha-2b recombinant interferon, which has been very successful in treating COVID-19 patients. And they've also developed a nasal mist to deliver it. And so everybody who comes in gets that and so forth. And of course, they depend on tourism. It's a big part of the economy as well. And so these are some of the things they're attempting to do, right? To try and deal with this, with the blockade, with the shortages, because it's not only the US economic measures, it's also the fact that obviously tourism and other economic trade has been affected, as it's affected many other countries because of the pandemic, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on in Cuba to use things more efficiently. And what it does is the COVID pandemic, but particularly the US economic sanctions, have exacerbated inefficiencies in the Cuban economy, right? It's made them, magnified them beyond what they normally would be in a normal situation. But the Cubans are doing their best, and they always approach things very carefully, very soberly. They don't rush into things. They always plan things very carefully. And they also, as I said before at the beginning of the answer, there's a very profound sense of social solidarity in Cuba that allows people to sort of close ranks and actually share what limited resources they have. And anyone who was in Cuba in the 1990s, in the midst of the special period when Cuba's economy contracted by over 35% when the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc collapsed, you get a sense there's this human solidarity that's inculcated in Cubans that allows them perhaps to survive situations that perhaps you and I would find extremely difficult and perhaps would cave in under that pressure.
And, you know, just to jump on that last point really quickly as it's fresh in the discussion, where does that come from? That sense of as you put it, social solidarity among Cuban people to have these limited resources and yet still want to or try to share it with others and persevere through what it sounds to me to be, and I'm sure to the listening audience, to be some devastating sanctions and embargoes against the Cuban government. So where does that come from, that sense of solidarity?
Well, I think there's four bases for it, right? I think oppressed and exploited people have always had to have solidarity, right? Have always had to basically have this sense of sharing in order to survive, right? So, and I think, you know, when we look at the, you know, for example, when we look at the history of African resistance in the Caribbean to enslavement, when we look at indigenous resistance, undergirding that has always been this sense of social solidarity, that, you know, the I and the collective we should not be in contradiction with each other, right? So I think that is one aspect, right? I think as well in Cuban history specifically, if you look at the Jose Marti, particularly Jose Marti, when the Cuban War of Independence was launched, the necessary war, what some people refer to as the Second War from 1895 to 1898, Jose Marti always envisioned Cuban liberation, right? Okay, when they were going to throw off the yoke of Spanish domination as being part and parcel of a continental-wide struggle for liberation, right? So he always envisioned that Cuba would be part of that struggle, right? Be part of a wide struggle, that Cuban independence was important in and of itself, but would not be as important, perhaps might be meaningless if it wasn't connected to continental-wide liberation. So Jose Marti wrote a series that's always of children's books, right? Okay, about the history of Latin America, okay? And he began with indigenous societies, right? So he always had that. Antonio Maceo had that belief as well. And Cubans also, you know, in the Cuban Revolution, they also say that Cuba itself was the beneficiary of internationalism. So if you go back into the beginning of the Spanish conquest, the invasion, right, of indigenous people, there's a famous story of Atue. So Atue was a cacique, a Cayano cacique, who was from, you know, what we call now Hispaniola, and he led resistance against the Spanish. He failed there, and he arrived in Cuba and tried to, and some people can make the argument, you know, the Cayano were like a pan-Caribbean nation, right? Divided into 5 or 6 different autonomous regions or departments. When he arrived in Cuba, he attempted to mobilize, you know, he mobilized them to fight the Spanish, right? And he was captured, right? And so, and you know, there's a famous story, he's captured, sentenced to be burnt to death by the Spanish, right? And Bartholomew de las Casas and other chroniclers record the story. And when he's there, you know, there's different versions of stories, but the Spanish priest tries, you know, as he's about to be burnt to death, tries to convert him to Christianity. And he says, well, are there any Spanish people in heaven? And he says, yes, heaven is full of Spaniards, right? And Hathaway says, I'd rather go to hell, right? And that's the first example we can say of intellectual resistance, right? So, but the Cubans say, listen, he left Hispaniola and came to an island. So in a sense, I mean, I don't want to gain in president. In a sense, Cuba benefited from his internationalism. During the first Cuban War of Independence from 1868 to 1878, there was Maximo Gomez from the Dominican Republic, right? We also have the Henry Reeve Brigade that Cuba has that's been nominated for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. So many nominations for it, right? From so many different prominent personalities. He was from the United States as well, right? So they have that concrete example, right? And so that's when in 1933, Cuba had the highest per capita rate of volunteership to go to help the Spanish fight the fascist government, right? And the fascist movement of Franco that was trying to overthrow the Republican government. So it's run through Cuban history. And even Fidel Castro himself in 1945 had traveled to Bogota, Colombia, right? To participate in helping those, to talk about Latin American solidarity and so forth. And then an uprising had broken out and so forth. So it's part of Cuban history. What the Cuban Revolution did was to take those traditions and themes in Cuban history, those ideas articulated by people like Antonio Maceo, the Bronze Titan, the Black Cuban who was so important in liberation struggles, and Jose Marti and so forth and so on, and amplify them and make them explicit state policy, right? Okay, and then the Cubans always saw that the building of socialism on an island was not just a domestic project. Internationalism, extending human solidarity to others. And Fidel says, if you can't help others, how can you help yourselves, right? Change, and the usual choice, if I can't help myself, how can I help others? He turned it on its head. So they amplified that and they deepened that. So from the very triumph of the revolution, you had the first and then you had the second declaration of Havana, so very early in the 60s. You had Cuba aiding African national liberation struggles and Latin American struggles because they saw their struggle, okay, as intimately connected with the global national liberation struggles, right, across the world. That was part and parcel of the, I think, the Cuban ethos and the Cuban understanding of what socialism meant and what this struggle meant as well. And one last point I'd like to make about the Caribbean as a whole. The Caribbean is a unique region, okay? Pan-Africanism emerged in the Caribbean. The major thinkers, when you think, Blyden, for example, right? Okay, in fact, Henry Sylvester Williams, the person who, who organized the first Pan-African Congress in London in 1900, was from Trinidad and Tobago. He actually went to the university I teach at. He was briefly here in Halifax, Canada, right? Okay, so he was here. And, W.B. Du Bois had roots in the Caribbean, even though he was based in the United States, right? C.L.R. James, George Padmore. So there's always been this internationalist sentiment in the Caribbean that I think comes out of its unique history, right? Okay, of how it was colonized, right? And how these struggles against colonization emerged. So I think all of those contribute, but I also think when I go back to the Cuban Revolution, it's because of the political will. It was the explicit political stance of the Cuban revolutionary leadership, right? Their understanding that socialism necessitated not only solidarity and building a just society within your own geographical boundaries, right? But also necessitated you aiding other people who were in need of social emancipation or in need of assistance when they faced very challenging circumstances.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Saney. I think what was really helpful with the points you're making there is that I think a lot of times the immediate impulse is, well, Fidel Castro, right? 1959, we have a revolution, but given that history and showing how far back it goes and how, I suppose, well, Marxists might say from a dialectical or historical materialist perspective, you're able to see how Cuba has reached this point of encouraging what socialism means to them and how they see it operating on an international level. And just kind of building off of that a little bit, you mentioned earlier on about how, in a sense, almost vindictively, the Trump administration has been punishing Cuba even further than the United States has in the past. At the same time, we know that this rocky relationship, so to speak, between the United States and Cuba has gone on for a long time. And even recently, in recent days, we've had the Biden administration say that they are actually going to continue to recognize Juan Guaido as the non-elected president of Venezuela. And that certainly has implications for the region and implications for people, say, for example, even in Trinidad and Tobago, where the ongoing crisis in Venezuela has impacted the population in Trinidad and Tobago. But considering the fact that you have this situation where the Biden administration seems to continue its hostility towards Venezuela, which the Cuban government has continually supported, and even others in the region, some more vocal than others. So Trinidad and Tobago recognizes that Nicolas Maduro is the rightfully elected president of Venezuela. But the question I have now, given this context and this period of time that we're in and moving forward where things don't appear to be necessarily shifting dramatically with respect to the United States policy towards Cuba, what does support look like from everyday people, right? Well, whether it's everyday people, academics, activists, humanitarians, you know, those interested in even just ensuring that the vaccine is available to as many people as possible. What does support for the Cuban people look like in 2021 and beyond?
I think that's a very important question, right? As I mentioned before, we have the Saving Lives campaign running, okay? It's also running in parallel what we call the US-Cuba Normalization Conference, right? Okay, that's what we call it. We had one in 2018. We had one planned for March of 2020, but COVID intervened and we did a virtual conference, right? And what happened in the course of that, which was unique in the left, was we were able to bring together a whole bunch of different groups. You know, sectarianism, unfortunately, is a disease of the left, right? And we brought all these groups together and we managed to maintain them. People who believed in reformism, people who believed we should only work and lobby with politicians, to people who believed we should work lay in the streets. We've kept all these groups together. And we decided to launch a campaign calling to bring an end to the blockade in 2021, right? That is our goal, right? And we've managed to keep all of this together. And what it's turned into is basically when, what was very interesting is that we've got dozens of resolutions passed at city levels, right? We have resolutions going into state assemblies in the United States and so forth, calling for medical collaboration. And when Trump, when Pompeo, the Trump regime, and Secretary of State Pompeo, former Secretary of State Pompeo, did that incredibly vindictive thing at the end and put Cuba on the list of so-called state sponsors of terrorism, you had all sorts of letters from reverends, right? You know, because you know the church tradition in the African American community is very powerful. They wrote letters, statements condemning that. We had Senator Patrick Leahy, a senator, right, who actually is now third in line to the presidency, right? So the way it goes, if the president were to die, it's the vice president. Or then the Speaker of the House, and then it's the President pro tempore of the U.S. Senate, and that's now Senator Leahy. He and a number of other senators wrote a very open public letter condemning that, right? And they want to return to the old policies, right? And I think it's part and parcel that there's been a lot of work done by grassroots people working and lobbying with union leaders, lobbying with officials, lobbying with ordinary people, right, to build this popular consciousness and witnesses. So there's this growing recognition, right, that Cuba specifically, not only needs to be worked with in terms of fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, but the United States needs to return to the Obama policy. We also have people who just want to focus on material aid. And so in Toronto, there is a group of Cuban residents living in Toronto, the Juan Galberto Association, that sent a container load of material aid to Cuba. And we've launched our campaign for that. So it takes on various levels. Some people are only interested in sending material solidarity, as we call it. Some people are interested in trying to change the government at the policy level. Okay. And I do a lot of interactions with Canadians on this as well, writing letters, talking to people and so forth. It's important to understand that just as the United States is, recognizing Guaido, or some people call Guano, we shall leave it aside from that, right? Okay. Okay. We have, for example, Chrystia Freeland, who was the foreign minister and now was deputy prime minister, was central to the Lima group, central to this, right? And of course, she had to be very careful with Canada, with Cuba rather, because Canada bought into this this attacking the embassies and so forth and all this kind of madness, right? Despite the fact, and I should make this point, despite the fact, and I can give you the link to it, despite the fact that there was a detailed study done in the Brain Repair Center at my university, Dalhousie University. It's one of the leading brain study centers in the world. And he did all of these studies, and the conclusions were that it was because when Cuba was spraying for the Zika virus, right? The people in the embassy had an adverse reaction to it. And that's what caused these effects. That report has been ignored by the Canadian government, or at least sidelined by it, from what I can see, right? And so we've been doing lobbying on different levels. And so I think, and the point we've adopted in our campaign is a multi-pronged action, okay, to bring everybody in under the tent. All we ask is that basically you oppose U.S. economic blockade of Cuba and support Cuba's right to self-determination, i.e. it should be able to determine its own political, economic, and social affairs without interference from an external power, right? And people operate on different levels. So we have people who just lobby, okay, and we have people who we would call radical Marxists, right? Okay, and all of us are working together in a multi-pronged strategy that so far has been quite coherent, has led to these resolutions, has led to very important personalities like Baraka, the mayor, taking stands in favor of Cuba, to prominent senators and so forth and so on, to ordinary people getting resolutions passed at their local union councils, or raising aid, organizing discussions and so forth. All of that, I think, works together, and all of them are not in opposition to each other. All of them complement and reinforce each other.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think it is, a lot of times it seems like a Herculean task when one says, well, I want to support the Cuban government and the Cuban people, and they're in a David versus Goliath fight in a sense when it comes to going up against the United States, and it could feel just so overwhelming to try and support, right? And I would say even here in the Caribbean, for example, I think you could see all these other actors that seem to be in play that have an impact and impact our even collaborative efforts. So thinking of going back to COVID-19. And
before you go, I want to make one point about people, this feeling that it's almost impossible. And we have to remember the five Cuban heroes who were in jail, 1998, right? I mean, some people, believe, they participated in the struggle because it was a moral and right struggle to free them, right? Okay, because of what had happened. But some of them didn't believe they would ever be freed, right? And then suddenly, I'm sitting in my office. I'm sitting in my office on December 17, 2014, and the Cuban consul from Toronto calls me. It was then Isaac, they're free, and you flip on, right? And they were free, right? So sometimes things seem impossible, right? Okay, but they are achieved. And I remember I've done a lot of work. I'm finishing a book called Africa's Children Return: Cuba, Africa, and Apartheid's End, right? And at one point in around 1986, right, there was this feeling of gloom and doom, okay, among many people in Southern Africa, okay, that, the apartheid regime seemed to be not only so intransigent, right, but at that time to be unbeatable and immovable, right? And then look what happened very quickly. And of course, there was that major military defeat of the South African racist army in Angola, right? And things can change very quickly. And sometimes it's important to bear in mind, there's a famous, Iverson was a famous kind of progressive journalist in the United States, said sometimes the best fight to fight is the fight that you're destined to lose. Because even though you lose it, you're laying the foundation for future struggles to win those fights and so forth. So I think that, there are possibilities, and the fact that the Caribbean has stood as one, okay, against the blockade, and immediately condemned what Pompeo did by putting Cuba on that list, right? That people are standing up to them. The fact that even though there's this barrage, and I see one of the questions here, about propaganda, right? Portraying Cuba as the enemy. Even though we have this barrage of disinformation, even Newsweek and some newspapers have to acknowledge what Cuba has done internationally in the fight against COVID. So there are successes, and the enemy is powerful, but they're not invincible and omnipotent.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I know we look to be running out short on time here, so I'll just explore the questions that we might have. Grace, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to ask. Maybe this question about the troika of tyranny.
I think that was the main one, and that's the latest one from social media. So, I mean, the question is essentially, what does it mean politically and economically to speak of the so-called troika of tyranny, and how can we resist it? What are, rhetorical techniques, dialectical techniques? What are ways that we can resist it, and things that we should read and to prepare ourselves when we're talking about this?
And I think that's a powerful question. You probably know more about this than me. I mean, we're all in this struggle together. And the troika, people know, refer to Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And of Cuba is seen as the epicenter, right? Well, Cuba is obviously, I mean, like when you have people like Bolton, who was involved in the Trump regime, they're Cold War warriors. They want to punish Cuba for having resisted. So I think one of the things is there's tremendous amount of disinformation around Cuba, around Nicaragua, and Venezuela, right? And, you know, they thought they would take Venezuela. They thought Venezuela would be very easily crumble, right? So I think it's one, engaging in webinars, engaging in discussion with people, challenging the massive disinformation, right? And that means working at all different levels. So, you know, I've put up in the link to the US normalization campaign. It's really a thing between the US and the Canadians. And we've done maybe 15, 20 different webinars, right? Okay. And we've had hundreds, if not thousands of people participate. And we're trying to challenge, we're trying to go beyond just simply the choir and the converted to try and challenge this profound disinformation. And it's a tough thing to say, right? But the fact, how do we challenge among ordinary people? The power of the media is quite powerful. The power of the monopoly media, as I like to call it, is quite powerful. But I think from us doing our work, our writing, our talking with people, working at the various levels of society. I mean, people may not have belief in bourgeois liberal democracy, but we live in we have to work with them, to working from that level to grassroots level to doing the webinars. I think it's important to do that. And pointing out that if these societies were so diseased and, as they were, why have they resisted and survived? And why is the overwhelming majority of the world with them? Okay, and it's basically the imperial powers who stand against them. And actually, another thing too is, you know, I know we're in a time of COVID as well. It's, you know, it's very difficult to travel, but one of the things we found very useful is people traveling to those countries, right? So the Canadian Network in Cuba, we've run since 1992. We weren't able to do it last year, obviously because of COVID, but we've run an international brigade that goes there. And when people see Cuban reality for themselves, they come back transformed. I remember there was one person who was virulently against Cuba, vehemently said Cuba was a horrible place. Went there, saw Cuban reality for themselves, okay? And were transformed. And, you know, we don't have to romanticize. You know, as Fidel Castro himself said about Cuba, he said, listen, we're not as good as our friends say, we're not as bad as our enemies say, right? We're neither heaven nor hell. Let's say we're in purgatory. We've escaped from the devil and we're waiting when we can make it to heaven, right? Okay. So in that sense, you don't have to romanticize, but you also can look at the UN Human Development Reports, which say, look what these countries have done for their people. Look what they've done compared. Look what they've been able to do under siege, and with limited resources to improve the well-being of the people, despite this economic war they have faced, this subversive campaign that never seems to cease.
It's really powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We only have a couple minutes left. I don't know if there's any last questions. I'm not seeing any on the chat, so maybe not. Dr. Saney, is there anything else that you wanted to add in these last few minutes that we have here?
Well, I'll say that, you know, one, we have a number of webinars coming up that might be important. Every 17th of the month, the Canadian Network on Cuba has a virtual picket against the US economic blockade, and it's international. We have people from all over the world, South Africa, Ukraine, Australia participate in it. We're planning on having a major international conference in May. May 21st is going to be the annual, that's when it's scheduled. Hopefully COVID will not delay it further, but there's going to be a major vote on the Cuban resolution that opposes and condemns US economic blockade. And we hope to have a virtual conference on the 22nd and on the 23rd, right? And we invite all the people to participate. The more people we have, the better. They build that critical mass, right? And have people from all walks of life, all shall we say, political philosophies, but who oppose the economic blockade and who oppose, political interference in Cuba's right to determine their own affairs. And in August, there's going to be the Summit of the Americas, and it's going to be hosted in the United States. So this gives us opportunities to write to various people, right, at various levels, right, to organize discussions and so forth, to popularize very good articles that have been written, to challenge this information. To challenge what really has been a crime, not just against the Cuban people, but it's a crime against all peoples. When you single out a country that has done so much for the world's people, for punishment, simply for being an example that another better world is possible.
It's great. Oh, Grace, do we have a one question before we go, kind of thing?
Yeah. I don't mind staying on longer. I'm passionate about this subject, right? And as a father of a 2.5-year-old, I'm very, very, very worried about the future she will inherit.
All right. Thank you for staying on. Just one last question that we have is if you can speak or if you have any insight into Cuba and the vaccine and whether there's been any attempt to produce with South Africa, for instance, like what happened with the antiretroviral drugs.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not aware of that. I know Cuba has spoken with Iran. I know they've spoken with China. I think if there are discussions with South Africa, I would not be surprised, given that previous relationship, that previous cooperation, that they wouldn't do this. But I think also some of them might, these discussions might be going on somewhat behind, secretly, in closed doors, because you never know what U.S. economic pressures will be applied, right? But Cuba is determined to ensure that this vaccine, right, will be available to everybody. And given the self-interest that the United States has demonstrated in regard to its vaccine and to COVID-19, given its inability to even vaccinate its own people, we might be relying not just on the Cuban vaccine, but other vaccines that are developed in the global South. I mean, a point I should make here as well, which I think it's important to bear in mind, which I think is more, Cuba's example is also very powerful in challenging this Eurocentric racist conception that knowledge generation only exists in the West and the North, right? I mean, Cubans have their own thought material, right? A thought material that comes from the experience of the Cuban Revolution, but also an experience, right, of the wars for independence, right? I mean, and where the Cuban nation emerged, right? The struggle not only of the Spanish descendant colonists, but also Africans as well. I mean, Fidel Castro defined Cuba as a Latin African nation, right? And so Cuba challenges these notions that people from the South are not generators of knowledge, right? And here we see them with one of the most vibrant biopharmaceutical sectors in the world, right? Not only in terms of the COVID vaccine, there's a vaccine they have for lung cancer that was being developed with a medical center in research center in Buffalo. There was actually a PBS documentary on that. They actually have a treatment. Diabetes is a huge problem in the United States, a huge problem in the Caribbean, but the Cubans also have a drug that, if given, reduces by 80% the number of limb amputations that diabetics have to go through, right? And there's more I could go in about what Cuba's been able to accomplish. And so I see Cuba also as an intellectual model that we in the so-called South, right, who are often dismissed as simply passive, hapless, helpless spectators, as other people do the thinking, are capable of being our own intellectual authors.
I think that's a really powerful point to point out that the knowledge generation and the fact that there is this perception that people from the global South, that we can't generate our own knowledge and that we can't, develop these developments ourselves, and that we're both either evil or that we can't help ourselves and contribute to knowledge too. So thank you for that.
Dr. Saney, just as we wrap up here, I think that this discussion has been really important. It's been insightful, and some of the key messages and key themes that I'm taking away, and I'm sure the audience is taking away as well, is the importance of internationalism and international solidarity, right? And just how necessary that is for us to overcome a pandemic that is really having a devastating impact on disproportionately racialized people, disproportionately people who working poor, working class, and not just in the so-called global South, but also in the global North. We see that in the United States, that in Canada, many of those people who are on the front lines, who are being infected and who are dying, in addition to other comorbidities that they may have as a result of dealing with living in a white supremacist society. They, on top of that, they also have to go up against this current pandemic and the impact that the virus has had. So the message here, based on what we have seen in Cuba, who, despite the fact that they have all of these obstacles, all of these hurdles themselves, keep pushing out the message of solidarity, internationalism, holding out one's hand for their friends, neighbors, even enemies, right? Because that is the only way that we'll be able to overcome the social ills of the world, the political ills of the world, the economic ills of the world. And I would encourage everyone who is seeing this to inform themselves. Dr. Saney, you've spoken to us about historical things that have happened historically in Cuba, things that have happened historically in the Caribbean, things that are going on now that people are not aware of because of the corporate mainstream media that so many of us are exposed to. The United States, for example, is highly propagandized, but a lot of that American media, I can say, filters into Canada, of course, and filters into the Caribbean as well. So it's really important for us, as I think you were trying to point out, to inform ourselves and learn more about what it means to support one another across nations and across the world, so to speak. So with that, Dr. Saney, I want to thank you for joining us this evening for this very important discussion. And let's hope that a year from now, we're not still talking about whether or not people should be relying on or supporting the development of Cuban vaccines as they seem to be doing now. So that said, thank you for joining us, and we hope to have you on for another discussion in the near future.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and thank you so much. I really enjoyed the discussion. And and as I said, la lucha continua, and I believe la victoria es cierta. The struggle continues and victory is certain. I mean, that's all we can do is struggle. Life is a struggle.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.